Hello, welcome to World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, this is session 3 of the last topic of the semester, Vikings, Mongols, and Aztecs. And now in this session, we're going to look at the Aztecs. We're going to now turn our attention to the Western Hemisphere and look at another nomadic group that will be also affected by climate change, just like the Vikings and the Mongols. And they're going to be forced to migrate to warmer areas in pursuit of water, in pursuit of resources and food. And in doing so, they will be invading sedentary societies, civilizations. In this case, we're talking about the Toltecs of Central Mexico. And over time, they will be taking over the region, gradually, slowly but surely, and then building an empire in Central Mexico that also, just like the Mongols, this is an empire that is going to marry, if you will, the skills of warfare of the nomads, the Aztecs in this case, with the bureaucratic skills of the sedentary populations of the Toltecs. All right, so let us turn our attention to the outline. So this is part 3, the Aztecs, and just as we did with the Vikings and the Mongols, we're going to look first at the physical geography of the region from where the Aztecs came from. The Aztecs, despite the fact that they're going to be building a very large imperial system in central Mexico, they were not from Mexico. Okay, they're migrants. Those are actually foreigners to this land that arrive from other regions. In the region where the Aztecs originated, or at least this is the region that they came from, is the region that today is generally called the American Southwest. Okay, the American Southwest, specifically the regions of what today is the present-day state of Colorado, for example, and parts of New Mexico. It is estimated that the Aztecs came from this particular area. So let us look at the physical geography of the American Southwest, which is vast. Of course, this is not really limited to the political geography of today's United States. Again, this really included even the northern part of what today is Mexico as well. All of that constituted a single cultural region. It constituted a single geographical region because all of this region really shared a lot of commonalities, the physical characteristics of the geography. Again, it's very similar, but also that the societies that inhabited this region also shared many commonalities as well. With very few exceptions. You know, the vast majority of the societies that lived in this region, let us just say by the year 800 or 900 AD, the vast majority were nomadic with very few exceptions. And the only exceptions were the Pueblo Indians or the Pueblo peoples of what today is New Mexico. Okay, those were sedentary agriculturalists. But outside of that, all of the Native American groups that inhabited this region were nomadic. Okay, all right. So, what can we learn from the physical geography that will enable us to understand the kind of cultural background from which the Aztecs came from? Well, in this region, for the most part, this is a region that consists of a very difficult environment. It's a semi-arid environment with rocky mountains and soil as well. provides, of course, a number of different wild plants that the nomadic groups gather for sustenance, but for the most part, they rely on hunting. A wide array of different animals that range from armadillos, for example, to deer, including in some instances buffalo as well. Now, according to some scientists, this region was not always, let us just say, that arid or semi-arid. Once upon a time, in the distant past, this region was less dry, let us just say, than it turned out to be because of the climatic changes that began occurring around 850. Archaeologists have unearthed, for example, a great number of sites across, let us just say, New Mexico and Colorado, for example. Those were clear signs that they were, of course, urban centers, ceremonial centers, inhabited by tens of thousands of people. There were river systems that were abundant, meaning that the rain pattern once upon a time was considerable during those years, let us just say before 850 AD, that allowed people to build irrigation works and develop large-scale agriculture. So once upon a time, this region was far more productive, far more green than the region that we know of today, that is kind of desert-like for the most part. What actually caused this change in the Southwest was precisely the cooling cycle that began to affect the planet around 850 AD. You know, this climatic change that spanned for many centuries. So because the environment changed, there's a cooling cycle, which means that there's less precipitation for reasons that I explained in session 1 and in session 2. A cooling cycle usually, again, affects precipitation. There's a drop in temperature, which means that there's less water being evaporated into the atmosphere, and that means that there's less rain. And so with less rain, there's less food being produced. You know, the vegetation is affected. And since the wildlife feeds off of the vegetation, the wildlife also decreases as well. And the societies that used to inhabit this region, the agriculturalists, for example, were forced to abandon their urban centers and their ceremonial centers. So this led to the massive abandonment of centers in the Southwest. The Pueblo peoples that I just mentioned in New Mexico also abandoned their ceremonial sites in great numbers because agricultural production went into a very sharp decline as well. So we see the abandonment of those cities, the ceremonial cities that were built prior to 850 by different groups like the Anasazi, for example, civilization, the Hohokam civilization. There were indeed civilized groups, you know, during this time in that area. Now, this, of course, corresponds with the massive abandonment of the Mesoamerican city-states. You know, we covered that in a previous topic when we looked at the Maya, for example. The Maya and the Teotihuacanos of central Mexico. Teotihuacan was abandoned in about the year 650, but the Mayan cities, which were over 50 of those cities or kingdoms, a great many were also abandoned by the year 850. From 850 to 900, we see the massive abandonment also of the ceremonial centers in the Maya area as well. So the collapse of Maya civilization was also directly related to this climatic change that affected the planet starting around 850 AD. Now, in the Southwest, the effects are going to be far more severe. As I mentioned, there's a drought that is prolonged for long periods of time. Again, this goes on every year, decade, and eventually centuries again, with precipitation levels dropping significantly. That led to famine. There's a population reduction as well during the Southwest. And there's also this population dispersal as well. There will be Native American groups that will be forced to leave that area because from their perspective, it became very hostile, uninhabitable as well. Okay. So this is the background of the geography of this region from where the Aztecs are going to be coming from. Obviously, they were one of the many Native American groups that were affected by this change. And as we'll see in just a few moments, they're going to leave that area and they're going to be moving into the warmer, more productive regions to the south. And they're going to be marching very slowly but surely into the Central Valley of Mexico. All right, so another important component of the geography of the Southwest, as I mentioned, is that it consisted of a number of nomadic groups. There were sedentary agriculturalist groups, as I mentioned, the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, the Anasazi, and the Hohokam. But there were also a great many of them that were nomadic. And some of those nomadic groups actually arrived into this region from the north because the cooling cycle ended up also affecting great portions of North America. And a great many groups that inhabited, let's say, present-day Canada, for example, or the upper states of the United States, they're going to be moving into the south as well, okay? And they're going to become part of these nomadic demographics of the Southwest. For example, the Navajo, the Navajo were newcomers into this region. They're arriving from the north. They're being pushed by the cold weather into the Southwest, and they're going to stall there. They're going to remain there in this region and adapt, to this, very challenging circumstances. The Aztecs were another group that inhabited this region. The Apache, Comanches, and there were others, of course, but those are really the major nomadic groups that came to inhabit the American Southwest. They're migratory, meaning that they don't really have a fixed place of residence. They're constantly moving, they're hunting and gathering, and so they migrate according to the seasons. And this is part of their culture, their nomadic culture, is that they're really constantly on the move. And they're moving according to the seasons. Another critical characteristic of the nomadic groups of this region is that they're very, very warlike as well, due to the fact that resources are scarce, and whenever the resources are scarce, the nomads must compete very fiercely with other groups for those limited resources. So they must conduct warfare from time to time in order to secure the needed resources, or claim an area for hunting, for example. If you want to keep others from hunting in one area, well, you have to wage war and the like. So this is, again, something so central to that lifestyle and to that way of life that this is going to explain why when some of those groups like the Aztecs decided to move south, they're going to overwhelm the sedentary populations of the Central Valley of Mexico, because they brought in mastery of the art of war, something that was lacking, among the sedentary peoples. Now, at some point, due to the climatic change that affected this region, we're going to see a great number of tribal groups moving into central Mexico. So Mexico will be invaded by what they label as the northern barbarians. In the Central Valley of Mexico, we see, of course, people living in urban centers. They were very civilized, and as they now receive waves and waves of those nomads coming from the north, they label them as barbarians because they had not yet entered the phase of civilization. Okay? And this is a process that spanned from 900 to the 1300s AD. So for about 4 centuries or so, Mexico is going to be invaded by the so-called northern barbarians. What is actually pushing the northern barbarians into central Mexico is precisely the scarcity of water and animal wildlife. Water had become rather scarce. The rivers some of the major rivers of the Southwest had dried up. And this led to a reduction also of animal wildlife. So whenever human beings are pressured by the environment in this fashion, human beings must develop alternative strategies of survival. Okay, this is again a common pattern in world history. Almost everywhere around the world, human beings, whenever the environment changes and resources become very limited, human beings become very, very anxious, very, very stressed, and they tend to leave their localities in pursuit of survival. And they beginning to migrate into other areas. And in doing so, this is going to lead to conflict because out of desperation, human beings must pursue resources where they are, and more often than not, the resources are located in areas where there are already very well established communities or urban centers that are taking advantage of those resources. And there's going to be an intense competition for that, again, for those resources. And this is the same situation that we see here in central Mexico. We see a great number of those so-called barbaric or barbarian tribes that were known by the Toltecs of central Mexico as the Chichimec tribes. It's really a word that, in a nutshell, the essence of that means barbarian, although the technical translation, the technical definition of the word Chichimec is it means peoples whose lineage comes from the dogs, in other words, the descendants of the dogs, in other words. Meaning that this is a really, really derogatory term given to peoples that have no noble lineage whatsoever, that in a sense they're being called stray dogs, in other words. Okay, barbaric in a nutshell. They exhibited no no manners, for example, no diplomacy. They will just arrive to an area and take resources by force, by just sheer brute force, in many cases, and more often than not, they will just initiate war, against other communities in order to seize resources. So again, they really were descending upon Mexico with a very violent and a very aggressive policy, if you will, of winner takes all kind of approach. The Chichimec, as they were called, or Chichimeca, as the Toltecs called them. So we see in the Central Valley of Mexico the rise of warfare. This is the byproduct of climate change. It is really altering the relationships between nomads and sedentary peoples. This is not to say that in the past nomads and sedentary people did not go to war. I mean, of course, there were sometimes confrontations between those two. But this is now going to become more normalized, more permanent, that the normal state of affairs between the nomads and the sedentary peoples is that there are constant war, in other words, because they're competing for land and they're competing for water resources. And remember, the nomads are not there just to take some food or steal some animals, etc., and then leave, but rather they're there to stay. They're there to take over, in other words, the region, because for them it's about survival. They can never, just take the resources and go back, because they're coming from a very hostile environment. They're not going to come back. They're invading and they're occupying now the sedentary populations. Okay. So the Toltecs, who inhabited the Central Valley of Mexico, they had become a civilization in their own right. They're quite well developed and quite advanced. And they're the ones actually facing the fire, so to speak, of the Chichimec invasion. Okay, the Chichimec invasion is really targeting the Toltecs of Central Mexico. And the Toltecs had just emerged as a kind of new civilization in the Central Valley of Mexico around the year 960 AD. And they built a civilization that was short-lived, by the way. This is a civilization that spanned all the way to 1160 AD. And one of the reasons of their collapse has to do with the nomadic invasions. Okay, with the nomadic invasions. So this is another very unfortunate kind of situation that we see the flourishing of a very advanced civilization. It's a highly cultural society. They have systems of writing. They have artisans, merchants, an organized religion with temples and priests, in a very, very sophisticated cosmology and religion as well. So they were indeed very, very advanced. Some scholars suggest that they were the heirs of Teotihuacan, the great civilization of Teotihuacan that we looked at in the past in central Mexico that collapsed in the year 650. The Toltecs appear to be picking up on the accomplishments of the Teotihuacanos and created a unique expression of their own in the year 960. And they built their capital, which was really the center of religious and political and even military power, just north of Teotihuacan, in a city they called Tula. By 960 AD, the city of Tula was perhaps the largest urban center in the entire Central Valley of Mexico. It really had over 40,000 people living in there. It was highly organized. They had pyramid, temples. It had an well-established monarchy that was ruling over not only the city, but it was really ruling over an entire cultural area. The Toltec influence stretched far and wide across central Mexico, meaning that Toltec culture became the norm, the mainstream across this region that you can see here in red. And it was governed by the city of Tula, okay? And it had, of course, trade networks, across this region, trading, of course, precious goods, and pretty much trying to create a new civilization in Mesoamerica. They were kind of the latecomers of the Mesoamerican civilizations, the Toltecs, due to the fact that there had been others in the past that have risen and fallen, like the Olmecs, for example, the Teotihuacan as well. The Mayas had already collapsed, by the year 900 AD. And so we see this is a new expression that was barely coming into the scene. And they're going to be raided by the Chichimec tribes coming from the southwest. You can see here, this is again a depiction of the magnificence of the city of Tula. There were temples, the temple of the warriors. You can see here, this is an archaeological site. Tourists every year visit this city. And as we'll see in just a few moments, this city and the priest and the ruler, the king that actually governed this city, is going to play a key role in spreading Toltec civilization far and wide across Mesoamerica. And one of the reasons, as we'll see, has to do with the nomadic invasions. The city will eventually be abandoned. I'll get to that in just a few moments. Okay. Now, it is at this point that it is extremely important to note that there's going to be a very important figure that will play a very critical role in shaping Mesoamerican history from this time onwards. And this figure, this king, the Toltec king that governed Tula, was was not really mythical. He was really a historical figure, but his image took on mythic or mystical dimensions in the eyes of the people. He was really considered to be a living god, in other words. His name was Quetzalcoatl Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl. In shorthand form, he was simply known as Quetzalcoatl, the feather serpent, in other words, the feather serpent. And he was considered to be, once again, the embodiment of the divine. He was a living God. He was to what the Christians, for example, Jesus was. He was a divine figure, a divine incarnation. This is what the Buddhists consider to be, the holiness of the Buddha, for example, an enlightened sage, a very advanced spiritual master, and so on. A god that walked the earth, in other words, okay, and became human. And he was the king, and he was the highest priest of the religion as well. So his title, Quetzalcoatl, also referred to a priestly caste, a priestly title as well. He is indeed a living God, but at the same time, he is the supreme priest and religious chief that has the supreme knowledge that gave the Toltecs their civilization. Quetzalcoatl is credited for having brought the religion to the people, the mysteries of life and death, for example, the understanding of astronomy, cosmic time, writing, agriculture, the arts, civilization, in short. Okay? And he was a very compassionate individual who faced the barbaric invasions, of course. He is indeed governing the city of Tula when the barbarians showed up. And the barbarians introduced into the Valley of Mexico not only warfare, but also other kinds of practices that he deemed barbaric. And those were human sacrifice and at times cannibalism, for example. So he opposed human sacrifice, and he declared human sacrifice to be abolished in the Toltec area. So he is contradicting, he's challenging the barbarians and their culture, trying to repel them, telling people to abandon and reject the barbaric practices and so on of human sacrifice. So he became a target of the Chichimecs. The Chichimecs now declare war on Quetzalcoatl, and they're resolved to oust them from power by all means. So he's going to face fierce attacks and invasions, and at some point, the barbarians will succeed in destroying the city of Tula and force him to resign and abandon the city, as we'll see in just a few moments. As you know, this is just, of course, a painting of how people actually remember Quetzalcoatl. So the city, this golden city, the golden city of Tula, will be destroyed as a result of, once again, the nomadic culture of militarism, warfare. Quetzalcoatl was not really a skilled warrior, so he's not going to have the knowledge, the wherewithal to deal with this new invasion, and this is going to lead to his demise. Of course, there is on the rise, of course, human sacrifice. Even within the city of Tula, people are beginning to take on this practice of human sacrifice, which he obviously and totally rejects. Okay, the practice of human sacrifice he considers unnecessary and totally barbaric. So the Chichimec raid the golden Toltec city of Tula. Quetzalcoatl will be trying to defend the city and is costing him dearly. A great number of soldiers die in this process. And one of the reasons why Quetzalcoatl will be defeated, it was not so much because of the military defeats that he suffered, which he was suffering as well. But the Chichimecs, according to legend, according to myth, resorted to the use of sorcery, okay, the use of magic and the use of sorcery in order to confuse Quetzalcoatl, to fill his mind with, wrong ideas and doubt, for example, and illusion. And in doing so, made him actually make very, very fatal, grave mistakes. One of the gods of the Chichimecs, of the barbarians, was the god Quetzalcoatl. He was considered to be the god of the night, the god of the dark. He's associated with warfare. He's associated with sorcery. The translation of the Tezcatlipoca means smoking mirror, meaning that a smoking mirror is really something that projects very blurry images, confusing images. So what it means that it is the God that really brings a lot of confusion in our thinking, in our perception. In other words, we confuse the shadows for reality, etc. And so, according to legend, this god showed up in the city, concealed himself to lure Quetzalcoatl to drink alcohol to begin with. And while he was drunk, convinced or manipulated Quetzalcoatl to have intimacy with one of his sisters, okay, committing what is called incest, in other words. Okay, well, he was actually totally intoxicated. So he was intoxicated, he lost his senses and judgment, and in that moment he became weakened mentally, psychologically, and he was seduced to have intimacy once again with one of his sisters. And the next morning when he woke up, he became totally embarrassed and ashamed of what he had done. And he himself was resolved to resign from the kingdom and abandon the kingdom altogether because he felt totally, again, shattered morally. Again, very ashamed of himself, and he did not consider himself to be worthy of being a wise king anymore. So he actually stepped down and he left Tula. And he's going to take with him a series of priests. So he's really abandoning the city, and the city will become abandoned altogether. People are leaving the city now. And he's going to take his priest along with him to march south. But before he left, however, and keep this in mind because this is going to become central later on to the Aztecs, to the story of the Aztecs, and particularly the fall of the Aztec Empire, is that as Quetzalcoatl is leaving, he prophesies his return. He said, I will return in a future date. Okay? He made a reference to the calendars, the Toltec calendars. He says, I will return in the year 1 reed of the Toltec calendar, which repeats every 52 years. And when I'll return in a future date, I will return from the east and I will destroy the Chichimecs. In other words, the Chichimecs are taking over, but I will destroy them all altogether. Okay? So keep that in mind because people never really forgot the prophecy, and this prophecy will remain central to people's lives, to people's thinking. And when the Aztecs showed up, they learned that people were anticipating the return of Quetzalcoatl to destroy the Chichimecs. And of course, as we'll see, the Aztecs will be the last Chichimec tribe to arrive to Central Mexico. They're considered Chichimec. They're considered barbarian as well. Okay? Now, one of the significances, again, one of the great significance of the fall of Tula and the exile of Quetzalcoatl is that Quetzalcoatl is leaving Tula for sure, but he's going to be migrating and moving around Mesoamerica, taking with him his religion in initiating a series of cults, the so-called the cults of Quetzalcoatl. And the cults of Quetzalcoatl will flourish across Mesoamerica from the year 1000 all the way to the arrival of the Spaniards in 1521. Okay? So Quetzalcoatl is indeed reviving Toltec religion in the south. He goes to several places and builds new temples, new pyramids, in order for people to worship Quetzalcoatl. Now, this is not to say that people are just to worship him as a person, but rather the principle that he embodied, and that is just like Christianity, for example, the principle of the divinity of human beings, for example, the divine person of Quetzalcoatl, which was really the divine manifestation of God on earth. So this is, again, has a lot of parallels with religions like Christianity, in that just like in Christianity, people worship God in the form of a human being, which is Jesus. Here we're going to see something very similar, in that Quetzalcoatl is really teaching people how to worship God centered in the image, again, of the feather serpent. So he goes and creates temples and cults in places like Cholula, as you can see here, the Mixtec region, just south of Mexico, and also the Zapotec regions as well of Oaxaca. So we see the flourishing of this new cult, and thanks to the barbaric invasions of the Chichimec, we see a figure actually taking this religion and creating additional cults and reviving this religion in other places. And one of the most important places that Quetzalcoatl visited and kind of introduced Toltec culture, Toltec religion, and started a new cult centered around Quetzalcoatl was the Maya area. Okay, so the Mayas are going to also receive an influx of Toltec priests, and they're going to adopt many of the principles of the Toltec religion and mix them with their own Maya principles. Quetzalcoatl travels to the Maya region of Tabasco, here in the Gulf of Mexico. He goes into the Yucatan Peninsula, and reportedly he even went all the way to what today is the country of Guatemala in the Petén region, which was really the homeland of Maya civilization. Now, during this time, the Maya civilization had already collapsed in the year 900 AD. So there were only a handful of cities remaining active after 900 AD. But, as I mentioned, the significance of Quetzalcoatl moving into the Maya region is that around the year 980 AD, he arrived to Yucatan and they built a city for him known as Mayapan. And that city is going to be critical in trying to revive Maya civilization once again. Much, much later, in the year 1260, the descendants of Quetzalcoatl that were still ruling over Mayapan are going to build a very large confederation or alliance of city-states. It was known as the Maya Confederation. It was composed of an alliance of 3 city-states: Mayapan, Chichen Itza, and Uxmal. I mean, they're coming together, and they are indeed continuing with Maya civilization, but with a lot of Toltec elements. So we can see that this is more of a Maya Toltec civilization. Again, that continues thanks to Quetzalcoatl, having arrived very early on, around 980 AD, to initiate this cult, the cult of Quetzalcoatl. And of course, the cult of Quetzalcoatl was the national religion of the Mayapan Confederation of the Mayas. Again, Quetzalcoatl was really, again, the national god that provided an identity for all the people living in the Yucatan Peninsula. So, directly or indirectly, Quetzalcoatl is really leading a revival, if you will, of cultures, is really leading a revival of religions and civilization, so to speak, in a very difficult time when there was, of course, climatic changes taking place and people were facing enormous difficulties actually continuing with the project of civilization. Now, this brings us to the story of the Aztecs. Again, the Aztecs are going to now appear on the scene. They're coming also from the southwest, from a place called Aztlan. Now, Aztlan is supposed to be a kind of a mythical place. Allegedly, this is a place that existed in the present-day state of Colorado, for example, in the American Southwest. Aztlan, the land of the Aztecs. According to Aztec mythology, the Aztecs originated in a place where there's 7 caves. So apparently within Aztlan, or within the state of Colorado today, there is a place that has 7 caves called Chicomostoc. And this is where, according to Aztec mythology, they originated. They are indeed a nomadic warrior society per excellence. Warfare is central to their way of life and their entire culture. Okay? For example, one of their major gods, Huitzilopochtli, is the Aztec god of war and the war cult. Okay? Huitzilopochtli, the main god that they pray to, that is their main guide, the patron deity that takes care of the people and so on, is the god of war, Huitzilopochtli. As you can see here, this is a depiction, again, of the god Huitzilopochtli. He's really wearing the regalia of a warrior. Okay? Now, the story of Huitzilopochtli, when you look at the origin stories, again, of Huitzilopochtli, it's just very telling. It talks about Huitzilopochtli once upon a time was a god that was born from a goddess, the goddess of creation. And when he was in his mother's womb, his 2 elder brothers became very jealous of Huitzilopochtli. He had not yet been born, but the mother was not really paying attention to them. She was just concentrating on Huitzilopochtli. He was to be born soon. So because they were so jealous, they plotted to actually kill Huitzilopochtli while he was still in the mother's womb. So just before the final act, where they were to murder him, he sprung out of the mother, just full blown, as an adult, already as an adult and as a warrior, and he pretty much killed his brothers, he slayed them, So this actually tells you that among the Aztecs, there was a very strong belief about warfare, about violence, that this was a very violent society that even justified, of course, the competition, the murder of family members, if it need be, again, that this was central to their existence. So they practiced warfare almost on a daily basis, and also they practice human sacrifice, just like the other Chichimecs that we talked about. And also at times, whenever resources were very scarce, they also practiced cannibalism as well. It was just considered to be an alternative source of nourishment whenever there's a lack of animals, for example. Well, when you conduct warfare, you kill an enemy from another tribe. Well, more often than not, that person will be seized and will be consumed again by the Aztecs. So keep that in mind, because this is going to be, very important for understanding the kind of practices, the kind of traditions and customs that the Aztecs are going to introduce into the Central Valley of Mexico. They will be arriving into the Central Valley of Mexico, which was called Anahuac. Anahuac was the region, again, of the Central Valley of Mexico. And around the 1100s of the contemporary era, the Aztec priests who were in the American Southwest received, according to sources and legends and myths, mystical visions of the god Huitzilopochtli, telling them to migrate south, that it was time to leave that area altogether. And then the pursuit of water and resources, again, that was really, again, the main issue. So they're now migrating. They're marching south. This is a slow march. And they're going to be taken into safe haven, so to speak. The Aztecs will be guided by the god Huitzilopochtli, which oversees the tribe in the form of an eagle. So they are eagles that are flying in the sky, and the eagle becomes the totem for Huitzilopochtli, guiding the tribe to move south, again, slowly but surely. And they will be given a sign where to actually establish their new settlement. And they're going to be, of course, the last Chichimeca tribe to arrive to Central Mexico. Okay, they're the last ones to arrive. They're the last so-called barbarians. Okay. As they move into the Central Valley of Mexico, they first arrive to a region called Coatepec, or Snake Mountain. They're getting close to the region where they're supposed to establish a settlement. And eventually they're going to be building a city, as we'll see. Then this is not yet it. But they first arrived to this region, again called Coatepec. Then by 1300, they finally arrived to Lake Texcoco. This is a very large lake in the Central Valley of Mexico. So again, they have found water now. This is what they were looking for. This is a gigantic lake. And all around the lake, there's a series of cities or city-states, and all of them are Toltec. Okay, they're actually the heirs of the Toltecs in this case. Okay, so they're arriving into a region where people are already living in civilization. They're living in cities. They're farmers. They're growing corn, beans, and squash. They're very cultured. They have systems of writings and the like. And this is going to be, of course, problematic for the Aztecs, because they're going to be looked down upon by the sedentary peoples of Lake Texcoco. They were considered to be wanderers, dirty, and uncultured, which, again, from the perspective of the civilized peoples of the region, the Aztecs meet all of that criteria. So they are indeed trying to fit into this environment. They don't know how. They see that they're surrounded by different kinds of city-states that appear to be powerful. Those city-states were known as the Altepetl. The Altepetl were actually the city-states of Lake Texcoco, some of which were very, very powerful and very dominant. For example, the Tepenecs of Azcapotzalco and Culhuacan. They tended to be the dominant parties of Lake Texcoco, the forces to reckon with, and the Aztecs will have to reckon with those two cities. Okay, as you can see here. So this is Azcapotzalco right here, and Culhuacan again, and just south of what is called Lake Texcoco. So there was a gigantic lake, once again, and it is surrounded by a series of cities or city-states, and the Aztecs do not want to leave this area. They are determined to stay here. They're still trying to find the region where they're supposed to settle and build a city, for example, but they're first dealing with their neighbors and trying to build relationships with them. They're troublesome relationships because the Tepanecs, for example, see the Aztecs as barbarians. They're Chichimecs anyway. So on one hand, they welcome them, but over time they expel them from their lands. They seem that every time they request a land grant or they request an asylum to be given a territory for them to settle, after a while they're kicked out. So they're being pushed around by the powers of that region. The peoples of Culhuacan award the Aztecs some lands to them called barren lands. Nothing was actually there, nothing was actually growing. It was actually full of snakes, and they did that on purpose. They pretty much threw the Aztecs into a region that nobody actually wanted. Everybody was afraid of it, precisely because it was filled of rattlesnakes and poisonous insects, etc. But to the amazement of everybody, the Aztecs were able to adapt into that region, and there were hunters of snakes, and they started making dishes of snake meat, etc. And so everybody was astonished at how the Aztecs were able to actually adapt into this very impossible environment. Okay, so it toughened them. It was teaching them a lesson of survival and adaptation, but at the same time, they started growing resentful, against all of those peoples in the region. The Aztecs decide that one of the best course of actions, again, for survival, was to sell their skills, the war skills of warfare, to the cities of the region, and they became mercenaries because often the cities waged war against another, and they started actually selling their labor as mercenaries and fighting for different cities, in order to make a living. And slowly but surely, they began to marry into the local aristocracies of the region as well. Slowly but surely, they're moving their way up, in other words, and fighting for them. And also they're marrying into the local chieftains as well. Now, when the Aztecs were going to marry one of the most powerful city-states, Culhuacan, they were given actually the bride, before the ceremony, for the bride to be prepared, etc., for the actual ceremony. And when the lords of Culhuacan actually showed up for the marriage ceremony, they were horrified that one of the Aztec dancers showed up wearing the skin of the daughter of the bride, which they had actually, the Aztecs had actually, sacrificed and flayed her body, actually removed the skin from her body, and they were actually wearing the skin of the bride, and this was, again, not only an insult, this was, again, pretty much an act of horror and an act of terror for the chiefs of Culhuacan. So the chiefs of Culhuacan actually kicked out the Aztecs, and the Aztecs are now once again migrating from place to place, moving from place to place. It is at this point that the priest received a vision from Huitzilopochtli that they're supposed to settle in an area where they were supposed to look at an eagle devouring a snake. So what the priest says, if we see an eagle devouring a snake, this is the place where we're supposed to actually settle and build our city. Okay, so they're now looking for that sign, in other words. Okay, during this process, they now render their services to the chiefs of another city of Azcapotzalco, and they become mercenaries for the city, and they started stirring conflict in the entire lake region. So they're now on the rise. I mean, they are becoming a power to reckon with. They're serving one of the most powerful cities as mercenaries, and they're building an alliance with them. In fact, the city is going to expand and is really on its way to building an empire in the lake. In other words, with the assistance of the Aztecs. It is during this time that the priest witnessed the signs of the gods. You know, the eagle devouring the serpent in the middle of the lake. In the middle of the lake Texcoco, once again, in the very middle, what we see is an eagle sitting on top of this cactus, devouring a snake, and that becomes the sign that the Aztecs were actually looking for. So what they said is that we should build then our cities in the middle of the lake. Okay, in the very middle of the lake, we're going to be building the city, and they're beginning to build this very large city. They move in dirt and rocks from the surrounding areas in order to build like a little island, in other words. So they build a little island, they level it, and they're beginning to build the houses and the temples, etc., little by little again. So they're really beginning to build a city called Tenochtitlan. Okay, the city of Tenochtitlan. You can see here, again, this is an aerial view of Tenochtitlan. It has causeways, of course, and, you know, little bridges into the mainland. And this is going to be the Aztec capital, so to speak. Again, it has canals, causeways, flower gardens, temples, and markets. They were growing corn, beans, and squash, you know, in the lake, you know, and floating gardens known as chinampas. Again, this was the farming method that they developed in order to actually grow corn, beans, and squash, as you can see. So there's really a hydroponic kind of gardening taking place, you know, that was very creative. As you can see, this is the kind of the description of the chinampa, the roots of the plants moving to the water, and they're sustaining that fashion. They grow, and this is how the Aztecs actually grow their crops. Again, the so-called chinampas, okay, the floating gardens. All right, so from this island in the middle of the lake, we're going to see the rise of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs are now going to build a capital, and they're going to be conquering populations far and wide across the Central Valley of Mexico. First, they build an alliance with other two cities. It's called the Triple Alliance in 1427 AD. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, builds an alliance with Texcoco and Tlacopan. Again, so three very powerful cities come together, they form an alliance, and they become really the core of the Aztec Empire. Okay, this is the very first stepping stone, as you can see. The beginning of, again, the conquest period of Central Mexico. The Aztecs conquered the Tepanecs and Culhuacan and surrounding cities, so they're toppling every single city of the region one by one, and they turn them into tributaries, meaning that every single city must pay tribute now to Tenochtitlan, pay tribute to the Aztecs. Now, at some point, we're going to see an emperor, Tlacaelel, is considered to be the architect of the Aztec Empire. He's really shaping the Aztec Empire the way it turned out to be. In what way? Well, he introduced new codes and laws and a new army. Okay, so he is indeed introducing a new series of legal codes that everybody must follow. It's a standardized legal code. And of course, he's raising a new army. Okay, there are warriors, that are trained in different specialties. Some of them are called the warriors of the Eagle warriors, and the other ones are called the warriors. They're very fearless, and they have different war specializations as well. The purpose of the conquest is to subdue the cities and force them to pay tribute. So again, they introduced what is called the tribute system. And one of the most important forms of tribute that everybody had to pay, besides, of course, foodstuffs and precious stones, etc., artwork, etc., was actually people to be sacrificed in the temples. Again, because human sacrifice is going to be central to the Aztec Empire, human sacrifice. The god Huitzilopochtli needed to be nourished. Now Huitzilopochtli is being conflated with the sun, and the sun, according to the Aztecs, needed nourishment to continue its journey every day across the sky, and that nourishment was with hearts, human hearts, in other words. So we're going to see as a policy is that every city that fell to the Aztecs needed to be every year sending people to the Aztec temples in Tenochtitlan to be sacrificed. Okay. He also burned all the historical records of the Toltecs because he really trying to rewrite history. That really history starts with the Aztecs. Okay. He's going to actually place the Aztecs in the very center of the world. In fact, the Aztecs acquire a whole new name. They're going to be called the Mexicas. From now on, this is from where the name Mexico comes from, Mexica or Mexico. And what the word Mexica means is the chosen people at the center of the world. In other words, the Aztecs is not just an ordinary people. They are the chosen peoples, in other words, of the divine. And they were placed in the very center of the world to rule the world. In other words, the Mexica. That's what Mexica means. The chosen peoples at the center of the world. Okay? And they're trying to connect themselves with the Toltecs, particularly, they're trying to connect themselves with Quetzalcoatl. Okay? They're trying to, by rewriting history, they're trying to claim that the Aztec emperors descend from Quetzalcoatl. And that the emperors are the heirs of the lineage of Quetzalcoatl. And Quetzalcoatl, remember, is the cultural hero of all Mesoamerica. He's considered like the Jesus Christ, in other words, of Mesoamerica. So what the Aztecs are trying to do is associate themselves with this divine being. In other words, as much as possible for legitimacy purposes. Number 4, they also extend the empire. They're embarking upon a series of conquests that extend far, wide, and beyond, not just the Central Valley of Mexico, but they're pushing the borders into south of Mexico and what is called, of course, Central America as well. Again, at the height of the Aztec Empire, they're going to control and rule about anywhere between 400 and 500 city-states. Again, 400 to 500 city-states will fall to the Aztecs. And they're building a very large land-based empire based on tribute, but also based on human sacrifice. Okay? This is an empire of tribute. They're collecting resources from all the tributary cities. They're also controlling all trade. So all trade that takes place across Mesoamerica, this region, is controlled by the Aztecs and is taxed as well by the Aztecs. And they're also controlling all of the religious cults. In many cases, what the Aztecs do is that they arrive to an area, they kidnap the gods of the people, and then they take those gods to Tenochtitlan in the city of Mexico, to force people to actually go to Tenochtitlan to pray to their gods, and in doing so, they will have to pay tribute, again, to the Aztecs as well. So they're controlling, in many cases, the religion of the people. Now, the Aztec society and religion. How was the society and religion of the Aztec Empire? Well, the society was simple. It was a two-tier social system, composed of commoners and nobles. Okay, the commoners were known as the Macehualtin. It included a wide array of different groupings: peasants, artisans, merchants like the Pochteca, and slaves. All of them were considered to be commoners. And in Tenochtitlan, people lived in barrios, what is called calpulli. The calpulli, or the so-called large house, was really a clan barrio. In other words, people that actually shared common familial connections and so on, and common ancestors will have their own neighborhood or their own barrio. So again, those were actually clans divided, in different sections of the city as well. They had a school for the youth. The Tepochcali, it was called the schoolhouse for the youth, and it was mainly a school to train the youth for military purposes, for military training. The Jaguar and the Eagle warriors, for example. So every male, since very early age, had to be sent to the school in order to be turned into a warrior. So this is a warrior society par excellence. The whole orientation of society is towards war, to produce warriors, in other words. Okay, the upper echelon, of course, of the Aztec society were the nobles, the Pipiltin, as they were called. They constituted the priests and the war captains. They were the nobility. And of course, the supreme chief of the priest, and he was also the supreme warrior, was the emperor, or the Tlatoani, as he was called, or the speaker. The speaker means the spokesperson of the gods. He was the spokesperson of the gods. They had their own private schools as well, to train them for the arts and the religion, for example, and the arts of war. Okay, you can see here, this is one of the depictions of the Aztec schools, again, of the nobles, as you can see. Now, in terms of the religion, the Calpulli, really every clan barrio, if you will, had their own local cults and temples. So every subdivision had a different patron deity that they prayed to, and it was the patron deity of that king group, in other words. Now, as far as the state goes, there was a state religion centered on the worship of Huitzilopochtli and Quetzalcoatl. Those were the state gods. Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, and of course Quetzalcoatl as well, the man god that the emperors claimed connections with. There were monthly religious fiestas and processions. Every month there were, fiestas that spanned for many, many days, for 10 days or so. And this went all over, again, the entire year in that fashion. Bloodletting and human sacrifices was constant. This is something that in the temples was going on almost on a daily basis, to nourish the sun, to nourish the earth for fertility, and to appease the gods. Why there were bloodlettings, why there were human sacrifices, was to feed the sun god, to continue his journey around the sky, to fertilize the soil for the rain god, and so on, to bring rain, and to appease the gods, in other words. Now, in order to increase the number of sacrificial victims, the Aztecs actually staged wars, not only for the purpose of decimating and killing the opponent, but for capturing populations. They were known as the flower gods. Again, this is something that got initiated in a great famine in the 1450s. There was a great famine. There was a great need to increase the sacrificial victims. So they started staging kind of phony wars for the purpose of capturing enemy combatants and to bring them to the temples and to be sacrificed, for warfare. This is something that occurred between two cities, Tenochtitlan and Tlaxcala, and it was just war for captives. So, this was just, a kind of sport of sorts, but the idea was to resolve the problem of the Great Famine, Now, the fall of the Aztec Empire. Why the Aztec Empire is going to fall? Well, it fell because the Spanish arrived in 1519 and launched a conquest of the Aztecs. It is very important to note that the Spanish themselves were really the heirs of the nomads of Europe. They're the heirs of the Germans, the Visigoths, and also the heirs of the Vikings. So they're coming from this nomadic, warlike environment themselves, which their culture became even more militarized when they were invaded, the Spaniards, by the Muslims, of course. And the natives of Spain initiated the Reconquest, or La Reconquista, trying to reconquer Spain from the Muslims, and that gave them this crusader spirit. And in doing so, after 700 years of fighting the Muslims, they acquired a culture of militarism and a crusader spirit. So this is really the background, again, of the Spaniards as they're now showing up on the shores of Veracruz in the Gulf of Mexico, is that they are indeed another nomadic empire that is going to face, another nomadic empire, the Aztecs. So this is going to be a clash, again, of the nomads, so to speak. Now, the decisive factors for Aztec defeat is that the Spaniards are bringing, of course, superior technology, steel technology. They're bringing cannons and horses, all of which the Aztecs don't have. The Aztecs are still fighting with Stone Age technology. They're also bringing epidemics. They're bringing smallpox and yellow fever, which the Aztecs have no immunity to. And this is going to decimate the entire Aztec population inside of Tenochtitlan. Also, another critical factor for the defeat of the Aztecs has to do with the prophecy of Quetzalcoatl. As a matter of fact, the Aztecs were expecting the return of Quetzalcoatl to destroy the Chichimecs, and they were considered to be Chichimecs barbarians themselves. And when Cortés showed up on the shores of Veracruz on April 22nd, 1519, that particular date, 1519, coincided with the year 1 read of the Toltec calendar, which really announced the return, the prophetic return of Quetzalcoatl from the east, that he was going to return to Mexico to destroy the Chichimecs. And this affected deeply the psychology of the Aztec rulers and the Aztec elite. And they believed, at least for a while, that they were dealing with a divine intervention. That, even though Cortés was not Quetzalcoatl, the Spanish conquistador, that indeed he was the representative, the ambassador of the gods. Again, so this is going to prove another, to be another factor for the collapse of Aztec civilization and the entire disintegration of the Aztec Empire. Okay, so summary points. What we have learned in this topic so far. Well, there are several points. One is climate change as a catalyst for nomadic innovations. Okay, the climate change that started around 850. This is going to be extremely important for setting off prolonged droughts that affected particularly the northern globe. Peoples that inhabited the northern globes were for the most part nomadic, like the Vikings, the Mongols, and the Aztecs. And that led for those nomadic groups to invade, and not only invade, but permanently occupy the sedentary populations to the south that were warmer and that were sedentary and agriculturalists again. And so by doing so, by invading them, the nomads are going to alter the course of civilizations. We saw that the Vikings altered the course of European civilization creating new states, creating the Kingdom of Russia, creating Poland, Hungary, Ireland, Scotland, for example, taking over England as well, taking over southern Italy and Sicily, for example, and creating an agricultural revolution that led to a commercial revolution and an urban revolution as well. Not to mention, of course, the Crusades, that in Europe people are now fighting the heathens, the nomads, the pagans, and turning Christianity even more militant. In Asia, the Mongols are altering the course of civilizations by decimating the Muslim world when they decimated Baghdad, for example. They also decimated Russia as well, and they introduced a new system of government in China. We talked about a new system of imperial administration as well. Here among the Aztecs, we see that the Chichimecs altered the course of civilizations and that the Toltecs are going to expand far and wide across Mesoamerica. Quetzalcoatl is going to bring Toltec religion and Toltec culture in South Mexico and among the Mayas as well. Okay. The nomads also create a new kind of empire. This is very important, that number one, they're really creating war machines and that combine the skills of the nomads of warfare with the bureaucratic skills of the sedentary peoples. And when those two get married, they create very effective and efficient war machines that were bent on expansion. So again, we see that as well. And number two, they also create trading empires, that the nomads saw the need to not only collect tribute from their population, but also control trade, controlling trade routes and trying to increase the pace of trade along those trade routes, because that was a more effective way of building and creating wealth and treasure as well. Okay, so we see also the rise of trading empires as well. Okay, so this is all I have for you for this topic. We are now ending this topic, and with it, we're also ending the semester as well. Okay, so with this, we're now concluding this course. I hope you have learned a great deal of world civilizations up to 1500. I'll see you then in the next course, World Civ 2, World Civilizations since 1500. Thank you.